Hello YouTube, this is Bian-Pullin and I'm a huge procrastinator. I have been doing everything in my free time lately except for working on the next version of my mobile game Epoch Go, and that apparently includes making chess videos. So this is a game that it's one of the latest games in my database, so even though this tournament is from over a year ago, this game was from the second North American Amateur Open, which was May 3rd of 2011. And my opponent was Alex Bian, and I had the black pieces. So let's flip here. I don't remember ever doing anything with this game before, but I have a whole bunch of notes on it. So let's just go through this, and I don't really remember much about this game, so I hope we'll find it instructive and produce a good video with a lot of points in the opening, middle game, and end game. So this was a modern two knights defense. My opponent played d4, so he's playing it like it's a scotch, but instead he plays bishop c4. And here I just play knight f6, which is going to transpose into the modern two knights defense. After e5, d5, bishop b5, knight e4. These are all pretty standard moves. Knight takes d4, bishop c5. This move order kind of invites white to go into this wild line. My opponent played bishop to e3, which is going to transpose to the main line of this opening. Here, knight takes c6 is possible, and it gets very complicated. After bishop takes f2 check, king f1, the king doesn't want to go to e2 because of bishop g4 check. And now pawn takes knight, bishop takes check, king f8. And what's going on in this position? White needs to be careful because the obvious move, queen takes d5, actually is a forced checkmate because the white queen is tied to the d1 square, where if black's queen were to go to this square, it would be checkmate. So after bishop to a6, giving check on this very sensitive diagonal, white is forced to block the diagonal somehow because his king has no moves. So after, say, c4, black just takes and sacrifices the bishop and goes to d1, checkmate. So that is a trap in this line. Don't play queen takes d5 for white. Queen d3 is the best move here because it prevents that check by watching over a6, and also there are numerous threats in the position. White is threatening to take on a8. White is also threatening bishop takes on d5, or just knight d2, challenging the knight on e4, which in turn undermines the support of the bishop on f2. So really, black's pieces are very aggressively placed, but if he doesn't play precise moves, he'll just get driven away and end up with the material minus for nothing. So bishop f5, possibly threatening some kind of a check, protecting the knight on e4, and also protecting the rook on a8. So here, queen f3 is the best move, putting pressure on the bishop, which is unprotected, and also threatening to win the exchange by taking i8. So bishop d7 is forced. Now if the bishop were to take, the black's bishop can get to this diagonal and cause huge problems. So You'd think that white would just have to exchange and it would be an even game, but he has this critical move, e6. Sacrificing the pawn, but forcing black's bishop to remove itself from the threat of going to this diagonal. E6 threatens mate on f7, so bishop takes e6 is really forced, and then bishop takes, queen takes. And this position, I'd say, is typical of the two knights defense in general. Black has a material deficit. He only has one pawn for the exchange, but he has some positional compensation for it. White's king is misplaced. Black has some control over the center. He has more development than white. But these are temporary advantages, and objectively, white should be better here. But again, it's the kind of position where I wouldn't mind playing this over the board because against an opponent of equal strength, because black is calling the shots in the in the early middle game and can possibly generate some additional threats based on his presence around the white king. So that is an aside. The move bishop to c5 here, instead of the move bishop to d7, which is main line. Bishop c5 just transposes when white plays bishop to e3, but it invites that separate crazy line. So after bishop e3, now bishop d7, and then white exchanges. Black accepts the doubled pawn. Castles, castles. Then white's pawn is going to move twice in a row, f3 to kick the knight to g5, then f4, and the knight goes back to e4. So really, white has gotten in this move f4 for free. But it is double-edged because the pawns cannot move backwards. So white is weakening his support of the e4 square. No pawn can ever challenge e4 again. He's also strengthening his support of e5. But if this pawn can be blockaded, then it's taking away squares from the rook and bishop. So that can, if that blockade gets in place, then it can sort of it can sort of restrict white's own position, even though it does give him more space, if that makes any sense. My opponent played knight d2 here, which is challenging the grip on e4, which is book move, and then f5. And here my opponent could take en passant, but this doesn't really promise white very much. Let's see what this would look like. New variation, and then knight takes. This bishop is hanging for check, so there's no like knight discovery. Well, I guess my opponent could play knight f5, but that doesn't really give him anything. I just take the bishop. But like if the white king were already on h1, then my opponent might be threatening to do something like knight takes c6, followed by taking on c5. Then he would have the unopposed bishop, the dark square bishop on c5, which is quite annoyingly looking through black's center at the f8 and e7 squares. So this is something that white can play for, that black should want to avoid simply surrendering the bishop for a knight on c5 and giving white the ability to operate from a blockading square in front of the black double pawns. I mean, oftentimes if they're double pawns, I've probably said it before, but the square in front of them, if that square gets blockaded, a minor piece there is usually very powerful. So that's why black would want to drop the bishop back to b6, because this way, if the bishop is ever taken, then black can just recapture with the with a pawn and still maintain control over the c5 square. But here, I mean, this position I think should be okay for black. You can just, bring the rook to e8 and, challenge the open e file. And black has two bishops against a bishop and a knight. So, despite the doubled pawns and white's 3-on-2 kingside majority, black's just fine after takes en passant. But white played the more dynamic knight takes e4 and f takes, and here we have a situation where both sides have passed pawns that have passed each other. That is, black has a passed pawn on e4, white has a passed pawn on e5, so they're sort of standing back to back. Black has the majority of pawns in the center, but they are being blockaded firmly by white minor pieces. White has the 4-on-2 kingside majority, so he should be playing to advance his pawns on the kingside and start some kind of an offensive there. My opponent played c3. It's a good solid move which reinforces d4. Possibly prepares a queenside expansion if white should feel the need to do this, or bring the queen out to the queenside. So c3, an all-around good move here. And then I played queen h4, bishop b6, anticipating that white is going to play king h1 and then be threatening some kind of a discovery. Bishop b6 in anticipation of that, by moving the bishop to a protected square. This is theory in this position. But also theory is the move I played, queen h4. And here my opponent responded queen e1, and the move I played was actually a theoretical novelty. Traditionally, black puts the queen on h5 in this position. But I feel that the black queen really belongs on this diagonal. And now that white has moved his queen off of the light square diagonal, I am confident saying, okay, black queen, you've done your job. I'll just return back to e7, which is the square I really wanted to go to. And now the white queen is on a suboptimal square. When you're missing a bishop of one color, oftentimes it helps to keep your queen on the same color as the bishop that you were missing. And my opponent might, if the queen were on a light square, might be able to think about a plan such as that involves queen h5 and g4, for instance. So my opponent then moved the queen again, queen to f2, which adds pressure behind, adds strength behind the bishop on e3. So the bishop on e3 is no longer hanging, and because the black queen is now on a square where it can be taken with check by a knight, this knight takes c6 is a threat. If you can picture knight takes c6, if it were white's move, and then bishop takes e3, this would be met by knight takes e7 for check. And if black were to just capture the knight, then after bishop takes c5, there would be a calamity on the dark squares. So now is the time for bishop to b6. My opponent played h3 in this position, which might not be the best move because it's placing the pawn on a square where it is potentially attacked by the bishop. But the idea is to play g4, without hanging the pawn, and then play f5. So that is the scheme that white is going for. He's just going to slowly push the pawns on the king side. So I play rook a e8, moving an inactive rook onto one of my well, I guess it's technically not a half-open file because I have a pawn on the E file, but yeah. So here the rook helps control the E6 square. So I can maybe start thinking about maneuvers with queen D8 to C8. If I need extra pressure on the light square diagonal, or maybe queen C8 to A6 if I want to do something on this diagonal. But I just want to make it so that I don't have a rook stuck behind the queen doing nothing. So that's my idea, is to eventually use the black queen to try and go to the queen side and get some kind of counterplay, while looking for opportunities to block and defend against the white kingside pawns. My opponent played A4. The threat is obvious, so I just play A5. And then G4. I think this move needed more preparation on the part of my opponent. Maybe not these particular moves, but something like King H1 with the idea of maybe bringing the queen to H2 and then playing G4. Something like this. You'll see why I would play like this in a moment. My opponent just put the pawn on G4, with the idea of advancing, or just controlling more squares around my king side. But I responded with G5, and I'm trying to show that this G4 move was premature. This G5 is an undermining move. I'm attacking the F4 square because F4 is the only pawn that is protecting E5, and it can no longer be reinforced by a pawn. So whether white pushes past to F5 or whether he takes the pawn on G5, I'm going to be able to capture the E5 pawn, which is like the masthead of white's position. And yeah, I mean, clearly in this position he can't take it because of the pin to his queen. But you get the idea. It's pawn structure chess. If I lose some material, I'm going to regain it and have the better position in the center. So my opponent pushed F5, which is predictable. Now he's attacking the G5 pawn, but I took anyway. Queen takes E5, bishop takes. So now there's a 3-on-1, his majority on the king side, but all of his pieces, for the most part, are behind the pawns, and the pawns are not yet in a position, where they can advance and cause me serious problems. Because I have, he's going to have to move his bishop before he advances this pawn, and I have the F6 square, fairly well under control. I have the G6 square under control. I have the E6 square under control. And he would have to move his queen, to get off of this pin. So here I like my my center pawns in this position. And yeah, he's blockading my my pawn chain with this knight on D4. But this knight can be kicked away, remember, if I advance my my double pawn. So this blockade is very temporary. So it is a very dynamic looking position which has arisen. And I think maybe if it were white's move, maybe bishop to F4, bringing the bishop back, and then maybe taking on C7. This could be strong. But it's my move here, and I could have played C5, and then when this knight moves, push the pawn to D4, so I get like a little steamroller in the center. to contrast with white's steamroller on the king side. And also, if there's some kind of an exchange here that would bring my bishop on b6 into play. Currently, his king and queen are both on that diagonal, so that could be a very powerful asset for me. So c5 was a move that was possible. Instead, I played pawn to e3. Sacrificing a pawn to clear up, or potentially sacrificing a pawn to clear up a road for my rook on e8 to enter the position. He can't really take this pawn because I have two attackers and he only has one defender. The pawn is threatening to take the queen, so the queen must move. And it probably has to move to a square that protects d4, because this pawn push to e3, it cuts off his queen from the support of d4. So we played queen f4, which makes sense. I think that's the only move to guard the knight. And then I push forward again, push the pawn to e2. So threatening to take his rook with check, and that's the most serious thing. His rook cannot come off of the back rank. If he plays like rook f2, then I just push the pawn, making a queen with check. So rook e1 is forced. And now I simply take the queen on f4, and I play rook e4, hitting the bishop, also the knight on d4. So I believe that this secures a black advantage, although the game continues to be very complicated from here. My opponent played bishop to g3, retreating and with the idea of going to f2 to guard this. The obvious move is bishop to h6, with a counterattack on my rook on f8 and taking away squares from my king. But if my opponent had played bishop h6, my intention was to play rook to b8. And the idea of rook to b8, it looks like it's doing nothing, but I'm going to exchange bishop for knight on d4 and then bring this rook to b3, where it's going to be very powerful on the third rank. And you'll see this theme come up again, in the main game. So that was my idea of bishop h6. Here I played h5, and it's an undermining move. I would like to take away the support of the pawn on g4 from f5. So I can just take on f5 and get another file, leading to the white king and also controlling the queening square. So h5, he probably doesn't want to take there, because then I would just play rook takes f5 and have a great position. But with h5, I'm threatening to, clobber his pawn chain. So he plays king g2, and I take, and he takes. And now I play a mistake in what should be a good position. Here are moves which are probably good for black. Playing pawn to c5, which forces this knight to move. Oops, there we go. What did I do there? Alright, playing pawn to c5, which forces the knight to move, and then take the pawn on g4. So this, it's a pin here, and this pawn is falling, and I'm still going to be able to play d4 and generate a passed pawn. And once I play d4, I can play the bishop to c6, and that could cause some action as well. If my opponent tries king h3, then I have bishop takes f5, and that gains a tempo because it virtually forces the king to move again. Yeah, this would have been a good position for me. Also, rook takes g4 immediately was good. If my opponent then takes the passed pawn, I play bishop takes. And then if he takes, I have bishop takes, with the idea of bringing the bishop to e4 for check. And even though this is an opposite bishop colored game, his king looks far more vulnerable than my king. Plus, I'm up a pawn. I'll be at a doubled pawn on the queen side. But this, this attack with the bishop coming to e4 and cutting across these squares, and these rooks are both on good files, and this would have been good for an advantage as well. I played bishop takes d4, and it's sort of like the plan that I had in mind against his bishop h6 move that I suggested earlier, but it's way too slow. C takes d4, rook b8, and again, threatening to take this pawn, and also threatening maybe to come to b3, which would be very effective, especially in conjunction with rook takes g4. So I thought that this, I'm still maintaining the protection of my pawn on e2 and getting the rook active on the b file. This was my idea, but going for one of those other lines that I just showed would have been better. My opponent should have responded to this by taking on c7. Bishop takes c7, then rook takes b2, king f3. And now the best line for black would be rook b3 check, king f2. Then I can have my pick of pawns, but the d4 pawn, because it gives black another passed pawn if I take it, seems better. Rook takes e2, rook takes g4, and he takes this pawn, and then I take this pawn, and what do we have here? I've got two pawns. He has one pawn. And this might be difficult for me to convert, because he does have his rook behind his passed pawn on the queen side. But I think I would have liked my chances here because of the possibility of attacks on the white king following the bishop coming to e4. And black's king is fairly secure. I mean, white could move his rook, to force an exchange of rooks if he wanted, I suppose. But then I could just move after the trade, I could just move my rook behind, and then his a pawn would be endangered. So instead of bishop takes c7, going for the simplification, albeit in a position with a pawn minus, my opponent played rook a2. And this, it does guard the pawn, but it is a very ugly move. I mean, this rook has it seems like this rook has no future on a2. Its sole purpose is to be a pawn guarder. And I played my rook to b3. And again, if you contrast the activity of the rook on b3, versus this rook on a2, you would have to say that black's rook is it's much greater. So it's one of the things that I base my advantage on. My opponent then took on c7, with the idea of taking on a5 and getting this passed a pawn for counterplay. I take on g4 for check, king f2, and then I take this pawn. So I think it's important to take this pawn, even though it's clearly not going anywhere, because it promotes the activity of black's bishop. Black's bishop on e4, controlling squares around the white king, would be doing much more than the white bishop on a5. In regards to center control and promoting an attack on the opponent's king. So it is an opposite bishop endgame with rooks. So if you have an opposite bishop game, then it's been said many times before, an attacking position with an opposite bishop game is like an attacking position with the extra piece, because your opponent's bishop cannot challenge your bishop, cannot challenge the squares that you're attacking. So my opponent plays rook takes e2. I wrote a note like positioning another rook awkwardly on the second rank, but it's hard to see. It's hard to argue against taking on e2. I mean, taking the passed pawn. So rook takes e2 is an okay move. Then bishop e4, and already stuff with like multiple rook checks, and I don't know. I haven't calculated any exact moves against moves other than my opponent's next move, but it seems like I should be able to generate something against my opponent's king, since I have control over so many critical squares. For instance, if he plays rook e3, then I have rook g2 check, and it's game over. But my opponent played a good defensive move here, rook a3. And rook a3 looks like an ugly move because it's allowing the exchange, which would give him doubled pawns. Doubled isolated pawns in endgame. But rook a3 is good because he can't allow, even if he has to ruin his pawn structure, he can't allow me to continue to have this rook be so active on the third rank. So rook a3 exclam, a clever move that prevents black from building up a mating attack. I answer with rook g2 check, and my opponent puts his king on the wrong square here. He plays king f1, which, because it keeps in touch with the rook, and prevents a rook g1 check, seems like the logical response. But the other legal move in the position was actually better. King e1. This leads to a position where it's not clear to me that black can, keep an advantage. For instance, rook g1 check. If rook takes a3, here's the point of king e1. If rook takes a3, rook takes g2, giving check. And then bishop takes g2, but bishop takes g2 is not check, because his king is on the wrong square. So he just takes. And this is a position which is certain to lead to a draw. But after king e1, rook g1 check, king f2. If he plays king d2, then rook takes b2, king e3, rook b7, attacking the bishop on c7. This would be quite good for black, because it simply leads to a position where black is up a pawn and white's pieces are tied up. So, and already, like, if the bishop moves somewhere, then it's there's already ideas like swinging the rook around to this side and creating an attack against the white king this way. So king f2, where were we? Oh yes, rook g1 check, king f2, and here black can settle for a draw. I mean, rook g2 check, and white cannot escape the repetition. I mean, if rook takes a3 instead, b takes a3, rook d1 coming behind this pawn, white can just defend with bishop to b6. And after king f7, this is fairly equal. So that's not very inspiring for black. So I think I'm not sure. I think that there's no good response to king e1. That black just has to take a draw. one way or the other. My opponent played king f1 instead, and I've already pointed out the flaw with this move. Rook takes a3. Because now it's no longer feasible for my opponent to capture the rook, because then rook takes g2 check, bishop takes g2, this is check. So my opponent must take the bishop, and then rook takes a4 is clearly winning. So after rook takes a3, my opponent has to take with pawn. And now I have this resource, rook g7. Rook g7 threatens the bishop on c7, and it also threatens bishop to d3. Now, there are a couple of ways for white to try and play this position. I think he chose the best way. He took on e4, giving up the exchange. And after bishop takes a5, and I play rook d3, winning the exchange, because of this pin. My opponent moves his king, and then I take, and then rook a7, which is going to win this pawn. So after like rook b4, rook takes a4, this requires a little technique. Only up the exchange and nothing else. But I think this win should not be too difficult. My opponent chose a continuation where which gives black a lot of difficulty by taking on e4. If my opponent plays bishop e5, this is a counterattack on the rook. And if I play rook check, then my opponent just blocks with his rook. So he's preventing himself from losing the exchange by playing bishop e5. But really, this is the worst way to play, because I just play bishop d3 and takes, and we exchange rooks. He's got to move his king, and then I take, he takes, and then king g6, and black has the distant opposition. So even though we've reached a pawn endgame with an equal number of pawns, this is dead lost, because it's white's move here, and there's no way that he can prevent me from getting to the key square on f4, after which this pawn will fall. So yeah, he played rook takes e4. I took. He took, I played, well, what's going on here? There is one pawn more for white. He has got one pawn for the exchange. And the issue is he has the, the passed pawns on the A file. And the black king is very far away. So he does have some counterplay based on pushing a pawn to a7 and tying my rook to the back rank. So the obvious move here is to play the rook to a7, winning material. And this is what I should have chosen. Let's say rook a7 is played. And bishop to a4, rook takes a4, king e2, bringing the king closer to winning the black's e-pawn. So then rook a8, king e3, rook e8, putting the rook behind the pawn. a4, king f7, a5, king f6, bishop c5. Because black's idea is to play king f8, guarding this pawn, and then that frees up black's rook to do, whatever it wants. So bishop c5, protecting this pawn and also watching a7. So rook a8, preventing the pawn from pushing to a6, very important move. Bishop b6, defending the pawn, and then king f5. So this I feel would have been better than the game continuation, because black has this idea of bringing the rook around, giving check, and then bringing the rook to to watching from behind the pawn. Meanwhile, the king would be driven off of the third rank, which allows black to bring his king into the position. So, or either do that or maybe bring the king into to d5 and c4. So this would have been a fairly straightforward way to win, by transferring the rook to behind the pawn. So that's kind of forced after rook a7. Instead, I reasoned that it's more important to bring the king in to to get to the center. So I played king f7, and this makes it harder for me. My opponent played bishop b6, king e6, a5, king d5. And here, my opponent played a losing move. This is the last attempt, or the last point at which my opponent can, create an unclear position. King f2. This is a very good move. It stops, still stops the rook from, getting into the position, and it controls the square. It controls the e3 square. So it prevents the attack that I played in the game. The attack that black wants to play is to bring the pawn to e3 and the king to d5. Because if black can get these two moves in, he can allow white to queen and, still have a mating attack on the white king, which we'll see in a little bit. So king f2, preventing e3 is critical. Now rook g8, getting to the back rank, because if I play e3, king takes e3, rook g3 check, king f4, rook takes a3, king f5. This is unclear because his bishop can hold both of these pawns at once. So rook g8, a4. Again, if he plays a6, there's king c4, which looks like it's winning, because I have the threat of going here, and also the threat of coming here, attacking both of these. So if a7, then king d3, and then white is in serious trouble. Or if he plays king e3, then just king b5. So that if he pushes a6, then king c4 would win because of the the threat of these two positional moves. Attack using the pawn, or attack white's material. It's almost like a Richard Reddy study type move. Whatever. So a4. Preventing the king from doing that by controlling the b5 square is a good move. So then rook f8, with the point being if he puts the king on e3, then rook f3 check, king d2, rook a3 is winning. It's winning because black still has his e-pawn. And he's going to end up in a situation where the rook is behind white's passed pawn, but still cutting off white's king. And so black can try a scheme like king c4, rook check, king d3. So rook f8, king e2, again preventing the rook from coming in with check, basically. So if I were to play king f3, then we just play like he would play. Oh no, let's try this. 3, a6, thing, a5. So this pawn now is cutting off the rook from getting behind the front a pawn. So this would be bad for black. Instead. See, if rook h8, then a6 pretty much equalizes. So rook a8 has to be played. and then the white king gets to a good position, where it's tying black's king down to the e4 pawn, and also protecting white's pawn on d4. So once white achieves this, he gets his pawn blockading black's pawn, and also black has to commit his rook to watching a6. This type of position, I'm not sure how black makes progress. I think white can hold a draw. But my opponent overlooked the attack created by e3, and he played a6, hoping to get to a7 right away. And my opponent, well, I played e3 with, the powerful idea of coming to f3 with my king. And so after a7, rook g8, stopping queening. And here, if my opponent plays king e2, I have king e4, with the idea of coming to g2 for check, and then coming to f3, and then pushing this pawn for victory. Or maybe coming to f8 first, and then coming here for check. I don't know. Black's rook has to stay here unless there's a concrete mating attack. So king e4. There's also d5, which is basically an exchange of pawns. It attacks the e3 pawn with the bishop. So after c takes d5, bishop takes e3, d4. This is very important because it attacks the bishop and also cuts it off from supporting the pawn on a7. So bishop d2, rook a8, and then this position would not be terribly hard for black to convert. So after rook g8, my opponent played bishop c7. The idea of bishop c7 is my opponent wants to put the bishop on b8, where it's protected, and this would cut off the black rook from the queening square. So then white would make a queen in the corner. However, I had calculated that I can ignore the possibility of this. If I have to play rook to a8 here, then my opponent just plays this and entombs black's rook. Although maybe I can take here. Yeah, this still looks like bad news, because how then does white stop black from just advancing both of these pawns? If this bishop ever moves, then just rook takes pawn. So, and this pawn can't do anything because it's not threatening to advance. So, my mistake, this would also win for black. So king e4, this was the move I played in the game. And then here my opponent played bishop e5, and I'm not sure why, but he's lost here anyway. If he plays bishop to b8, which is the consistent move, then I play king f3. And after like a8 queen, e2 check, king e1, and this is a forced mate, believe it or not. Rook g1 check, king e2, e1 queen check, king e3, queen b1 check. I mean, with both sides having the queen on the board so open, the side with the initiative is usually winning. Rook e1 check, king d2, queen c2 mate. So kind of pointless to show that, but there is a mate there. So instead of that, he played bishop e5, and then king f3, and he showed this idea with bishop h2, simply stopping the rook check. So I played rook h8, and at this point I knew that I was winning for sure, because, well, simply put, my opponent is going to run out of good moves. He plays bishop to g1, which is kind of a sad move, but anyway, the game concluded. Rook h1, a8 queen, e2 check, here takes, e1 queen check, queen e2 check, and you know, with 2 queens and an extra rook, it's not surprising there was a forced mate. So yeah, that game had an interesting opening, middle game, and end game, in which there were numerous mistakes. But I mean, that's what makes it interesting, really, is the you know, the wealth of mistakes there, and the every time there are mistakes in a chess game, there are new ideas which you know, which can be shown, resulting from those. So that's why I thought this game, you know, because I had so many variations and notes on it, might be good to go over, just you know, just for, you know, educational value. Yeah, I'm not really talking about anything right now. It's just well, I hope you enjoyed that video, even if it was a little on the long side. Have a good one, YouTube.